So we're standing here at the private jet terminal at Berlin Airport, and you can see behind me here the police are about to break up a scientist rebellion protest against private jet use. We're here today to find out why so many scientists are participating in these acts of civil disobedience and whether it's okay for them to do that. But also, is this the best way to change minds?
Science, unscripted.
That guy talking right there is Nico Froitzheim. During the day, he's a professor of geology, and we went to his university in Bonn to find out why he joined the scientist rebellion movement and decided to start breaking the law on behalf of the climate.
I decided to engage in civil disobedience when I understood that our government is not willing to make sufficient measures against climate crisis. So they are refusing to accept reality, the reality of the climate crisis, and they are trying to continue business as usual. And this was in spite of all these demonstrations and in spite of these climate reports and all the evidence. So they just want to go on as always.
I think a lot of people around the world have felt disappointed or frustrated with their government at some point, that they're not doing enough to combat climate change. But feeling that frustration or disappointment is very different from going out and doing something that's illegal to stop it. So why? That's a big step. It's a huge step.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing all the rest as well. I'm teaching about climate crisis. I'm going to these demonstrations. I'm discussing with politicians. I do all this stuff, but it's not enough because these things have been done all the time for 30 or 40 years, and it didn't help. And civil disobedience is from history. It is known that it works, or it can work. And in spite of continuing with all this old stuff that does not work, is not enough, it's a chance to do something new that may work.
The night before that private jet protest at Berlin Airport, I went to visit Lisa Bogerts. She's a researcher in the field of social protest. And what I really wanted to find out was, when does civil disobedience make sense?
If a social movement protest has been trying different tools and different tactics of protest for a while, and it sees that they have not had the effect that they were wishing for, then it definitely makes sense to use another tool and for instance to be more disruptive than before, and for instance also to apply civil disobedience to see if it works. So from the perspective of repertoires of contention and protest cycles, it makes total sense, like to try, but there's no way to tell that it will be effective because it depends on so many factors, right? It depends on whether this form of tool will be legitimate in the eye of the public. It depends also on the society, like what are the other discourses it's situating in. It also depends on whether the movement is able to feed into a broader narrative and to also make clear why it is important, right? Because the effectiveness of protest loses or like gets lost if the activists are not able to also communicate their actual demands. Because what we're talking about all the time is just the form, and what actually counts is the content, right? So and when the public only talks about the form, but they don't really understand what is the actual content of the demands, then it won't be successful, right? So you have to link these two things. And if this protest movement manages to do it in an effective way, then it's probably a good idea to try.
Back at the Berlin airport private jet protest, the police officers went around and took the names of everyone who was there, and that includes the journalists. Let me be clear here. There is a real risk going to an event like this one, and yet the scientists involved in the scientist rebellion don't really care.
What I would hope that people taking action which is in line with the science and has historical foundations as being an effective form of direct action. I would hope that people do not have to risk their careers and their jobs for that. However, we're in a risky situation is the bottom line of it. What we have to do is emotionally very difficult, but actually fairly straightforward. We need to confront power and systems of power that are holding back change. The fossil fuel industry, obviously. We're here at an airport for private jets. But at the end of the day, we also have to speak to our values. You know, you can have all the reports and the data and the graphs that you want. At the end of the day, that hasn't been enough. We've known that the science was clear for decades. What we need now is to look at our values. What do I personally value? What do I see in this society as worthwhile fighting for saving?
But what happens if those values don't actually line up with the extreme nature of the protest?
I don't support the protests, but I feel a certain sympathy because it's important that with what the people want to be seen is seen. So, and the Fridays for Future, they go and go and go and nothing happens, or not so much. And I think to try out some other forms of protest is okay, but I don't support this form. So I'm in between a little bit.
My name is Colin Davis. I'm chairing cognitive psychology at the University of Bristol. And one of the strands of my research is about the psychology of protest, and in particular, the impact that protest has on observers.
What should protesters not do? What is the red line where most of the general public will say, you know what, forget you, whatever you stood for before, I don't care anymore. I'm not with you.
Well, I think where that line is will differ for different groups. So if you consider quite large organizations, you know, a group like Greenpeace, for instance, then some of the sorts of tactics that we've seen recently, like, you know, throwing super paintings and so on, wouldn't be good tactics for Greenpeace because they would lose a lot of members, you know, their donations would go down. They wouldn't have the same opportunities to sit at the table with government actors and so on. But for smaller groups, you know, like Just Stop Oil, there are relatively few people who will engage in the kinds of tactics that they perform. And so getting lots of attention is a good way for them to find those people. So they can actually increase their numbers. When people see so-called radical groups engaging in these more extreme tactics, one of the impacts of that is that the moderate factions are perceived as more moderate. So Greenpeace becomes even more mainstream and kind of centrist and sensible by virtue of the actions of groups like Just Stop Oil. And that can have a beneficial effect on the number of donations that Greenpeace gets and their general levels of support. So perhaps counterintuitively, radical tactics can have a positive effect on the climate movement as a whole.
Is it fair to say, based on the research, that acts of civil disobedience really work? They're a very effective form of protest, and that the reward, it sounds like, is higher than the risk of going, quote unquote, too far?
I think the risks of going too far that we often hear about are greatly overblown. So I don't think there's good evidence for protest having a counterproductive effect in the sense of turning people away from a cause. Now, it's a separate question as to is civil disobedience effective in bringing about the intended changes? There, it's much harder to say. So we can look at historical examples where it seems that civil disobedience has been effective. I mean, the US civil rights movement is a good example. People often talk about the suffragettes. So in this country, people like to say that women got the right to vote because of the actions of the suffragettes, but actually it's very hard to know. And some people would say that, that there was no impact of the suffragettes, or even that may have been counterproductive. So it's hard to find out about these questions, sometimes even after a long time. But for people who are engaged in these movements and trying to bring about change, I think there is good reason to think that civil disobedience is one of the approaches that is most likely to enable them to bring about change.
I think it's nothing new that movements are so radical. It's like with wars or like political crises. Like every time there are a lot of wars, we think like, okay, what's happening in the world? Like what goes wrong? But then like it comes again and again, right? So I think also in recent years, there have been a lot of waves of like very radical protest, and every time people ask themselves, okay, is this a new era? So I would say probably no. What's probably new is that such young people take the lead because of the relevance for them of the topic of climate change, and also of course communication is getting more visual, right? And also the whole logic of social media changed the complete picture of how protest is communicated and what's the logic of like shares and clicks and likes and so on. So that definitely, yeah, would be an indicator for a new era. But I don't think that this is a one-time thing of, how radical protests are in the next years to come.
I have children and I have grandchildren, and their future is extremely threatened by this climate catastrophe or climate crisis. To help humanity survive on this planet is probably the best legitimation that you can think of. Civil disobedience occurs or is exerted when there is a strong injustice. It's against injustice. And when the injustice becomes too great, civil disobedience becomes legitimate. And it's not only legitimate, it is mandatory. It's not only legitimate, it's something that we have to do.
So the data seems to clearly support the idea that civil disobedience works, and it's one of the tools that groups can use to cause social change, and that there are groups of scientists out there who firmly believe that other scientists now have an obligation to leave the lab, to not just report on data, to go out and actually engage in actions and stand behind it. The question is, how quickly will that actually change people's behavior, including mine, going into the airport right here and hopping on a flight? That's a very open question. We'd love to hear what you think about this. Leave a comment down below or email us. We're su@dw.com.